Before she became the most awarded female artist of all time, before her name was etched into the collective memory of the world as a voice that could shake heaven itself, Whitney Elizabeth Houston was just a young girl in Newark, New Jersey, a child born into music, faith, and a lineage of soul that seemed destined to define her. But destiny, as her story would prove, is never simple. Whitney was born on August 9, 1963, to John and Cissy Houston. Her mother, Emily "Cissy" Houston, was already a respected gospel singer, a powerhouse vocalist who sang backup for Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick, and another cousin, Dee Dee Warwick, had her own celebrated career. Whitney grew up surrounded by legends, women who carried pain, power, and faith in their voices. The walls of the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark were a first stage, and that church choir was the first audience to hear what many would later call the voice of a generation. Even as a child, Whitney's voice carried an otherworldly quality. People would stop mid-conversation when she sang, her tone pure, crystalline, soaring beyond her years. The congregation would often fall silent after she performed, as if stunned by what they had just heard. Her mother recognized the gift immediately, but she also knew the danger that came with it, the burden of perfection, the weight of expectation. Cissy was a disciplinarian in music. She trained Whitney hard, making her repeat songs until every breath, every note, and every run was flawless. Whitney later recalled, "If I was going to do it, I had to do it right. My mother didn't believe in half-stepping." By her teenage years, Whitney began singing professionally, backing up her mother at New York City clubs. She was tall, graceful, and strikingly beautiful, a natural star, though she didn't yet realize it. At just 15, she was discovered by a photographer who saw her performing and encouraged her to model. Soon, she was featured on the cover of 17 magazine, one of the first black women ever to grace that publication's front page. But while modeling offered glamour and visibility, it was always the stage that called her home. In 1983, everything changed. Clive Davis, the legendary music executive behind Arista Records, saw Whitney perform in a nightclub alongside her mother. He was mesmerized. Her voice, raw yet refined, angelic yet powerful, struck him immediately. Davis, who had a gift for spotting timeless talent, knew he was witnessing something rare. He offered her a recording contract on the spot. It would become one of the most successful signings in music history. Whitney's debut album, simply titled Whitney Houston, was released in 1985. The cover showed her in a simple white dress, minimal makeup, natural beauty radiating from her face. There were no gimmicks, no flashy outfits, no dramatic poses. Just Whitney. And that was all it took. Her voice, unfiltered and divine, captivated the world. Songs like "Saving All My Love for You," "How Will I Know," and "Greatest Love of All" dominated radio stations across the globe. Each track displayed a new facet of her artistry, playful, passionate, powerful. By the end of that year, Whitney was a household name. She had arrived. But what set Whitney apart wasn't just her technical brilliance, it was her emotion. She sang like she was living the story behind every lyric. When she sang about love, you felt the ache. When she sang about hope, you believed it. In an industry often obsessed with style over substance, Whitney was both effortlessly glamorous and undeniably gifted. Her second album, Whitney, released in 1987, shattered records. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, the first album by a female artist ever to do so. The singles were unstoppable: "I Wanna Dance with Somebody," "Didn't We Almost Have It All," "So Emotional," "Where Do Broken Hearts Go?" Each song became an anthem, and Whitney became an emblem of joy, freedom, and vocal perfection. She was the soundtrack of weddings, graduations, heartbreaks, and celebrations. The 1980s belonged to Whitney Houston. She was the queen of pop, R&B, and soul all at once, a crossover star whose appeal transcended race and genre. Her influence reached from gospel choirs in small churches to global stages packed with millions. Young singers began mimicking her vocal runs, her tone, her phrasing. For an entire generation of girls, Whitney was proof that you could come from the church and conquer the world. But with every new triumph came greater pressure. Her image was carefully curated, the America's sweetheart archetype, flawless in every performance, humble in every interview, untouchable in her poise. Yet, behind the scenes, the machinery of fame was grinding. Arista Records wanted perfection, the public demanded it. Whitney was expected to smile, to sing, to shine, every time. The girl who once sang for the love of God now sang for the weight of millions. Still, Whitney's power seemed limitless. In 1991, she performed the U.S. national anthem at the Super Bowl, a rendition so flawless it became the standard by which all others were measured. Dressed in a simple white tracksuit, her hair pulled back, she didn't rely on theatrics or dramatics. Her voice did all the work. When she hit the high notes, the crowd erupted, not out of patriotism alone, but awe. It wasn't just a performance, it was a prayer in song. That recording would later be re-released during the Gulf War, becoming a symbol of unity and resilience. Then came The Bodyguard in 1992. The film paired Whitney with Kevin Costner, and while critics were mixed on the movie itself, the soundtrack became one of the greatest of all time. Her cover of Dolly Parton's "I Will Always Love You" was transcendent. That key change, that soaring final chorus, froze time. The song became an instant classic, spending 14 consecutive weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and selling over 20 million copies worldwide. Whitney wasn't just a singer anymore, she was an icon of cinematic and musical history. Everywhere she went, fans wept, screamed, and reached out to touch her. Little girls wanted to sing like her, grown men admitted to crying when they heard her voice. Awards piled up, Grammys, AMAs, Billboard trophies. The media called her the voice. It wasn't hyperbole. There was simply no one else like her. Yet, behind her megawatt smile, cracks were beginning to form. The higher she climbed, the lonelier it became. Fame was both her crown and her cage. She was constantly compared to others, to Aretha, to Diana, to Mariah. Every note was analyzed, every photo dissected. Rumors swirled about her relationships, her family, her personal life. Her father, who had managed parts of her career, grew increasingly controlling. And though her mother's tough love had shaped her discipline, it also made her feel she could never falter, never be human. In 1992, at the peak of her success, Whitney married R&B singer Bobby Brown. The world watched in fascination and confusion. Bobby was seen as the bad boy of R&B, wild, impulsive, unpredictable. Whitney, on the other hand, had been packaged as polished and pure. Many thought their union was doomed from the start. But Whitney loved fiercely, and she was drawn to Bobby's raw energy, his authenticity, and perhaps, his rebellion. He represented freedom, from her image, from her expectations, from the weight of perfection she had carried since childhood. Together, they were explosive. Their marriage was passionate, chaotic, and deeply public. Paparazzi followed their every move, tabloids spun endless stories about their fights, their affection, and later, their drug use. But in those early years, Whitney still tried to keep control, still tried to balance the woman the world wanted with the woman she was becoming. As the 1990s continued, the pressures mounted. New artists emerged, the industry evolved, and Whitney was expected to evolve with it. The media began to shift its tone, the same outlets that once worshipped her started hunting for flaws. Her voice, still powerful, began showing strain. Critics whispered that she had lost her magic. But in truth, she was losing something deeper, peace. And yet, even amid the turbulence, Whitney continued to shine on stage. Those who saw her live remember her presence, how the air changed when she sang, how she could command a stadium with a single note. Her voice was more than sound, it was spirit. It was survival. By the time the new millennium arrived, Whitney Houston had achieved what few ever could. Over 200 million records sold. Hundreds of awards. A name synonymous with greatness. But fame, once her blessing, was slowly becoming her burden. The church girl from Newark had conquered the world, and now the world wouldn't let her rest. Behind the glamour, she was beginning to fade. But that part of the story, the slow unraveling of a woman who once stood at the height of music royalty, would come later. For now, in this part of her journey, Whitney was still the beacon of light, still the woman whose voice defined a generation, still the girl who believed that singing was her gift from God. Her rise was meteoric, dazzling, and unmatched. Yet, as history has shown us time and again, the higher the star climbs, the further it can fall. And for Whitney, that fall would come not as a single moment, but as a long, Heartbreaking descent. When Whitney Houston married Bobby Brown on July 18, 1992, the world called it the wedding of opposites. The princess of pop and the rebel of R&B. The poised, angelic superstar and the street-smart bad boy. The tabloids had a field day, labeling it a collision of worlds, a fairy tale doomed by its own fire. But for Whitney, it wasn't a collision, it was connection. For once in her life, she felt seen. Bobby didn't worship her the way the world did, he loved her like she was human. They met backstage at the Soul Train Music Awards in 1989. Bobby was already a rising star, riding high off his solo hits like My Prerogative. He was brash, charming, and unpredictable. Whitney, by contrast, was poised and graceful, used to perfection, used to control. But when Bobby made her laugh that night, it was genuine, unfiltered. She later said, "He made me feel safe to be myself." For a woman who had spent her entire adult life behind the glass of celebrity, that feeling was priceless. Their courtship was fast, passionate, and unconventional. Bobby proposed with a diamond ring that seemed to catch light from every angle, but what really drew Whitney in wasn't the sparkle, it was the chaos. He challenged her. He was real in ways fame had stripped from her life. And yet, with that passion came volatility. Friends noticed how quickly love turned into arguments, how jealousy flared between them. Still, Whitney believed that their love, no matter how intense, could withstand anything. Their wedding was lavish, 800 guests, acres of flowers, gospel choirs, and glimmering gold details. Whitney walked down the aisle in an ivory gown with a 16-foot train, her smile wide and radiant. Bobby wept openly as she approached. For a brief moment, it was everything she'd dreamed of, a love story unfolding in front of the entire world. But even then, some guests whispered that this union would test Whitney in ways her fame never had. The early years of their marriage were passionate but turbulent. Bobby's fame came with its own share of temptations, women, partying, and the relentless scrutiny of the press. He was often portrayed as the villain corrupting America's sweetheart, the man who had introduced Whitney to darker vices. But insiders would later claim the truth was more complicated. Whitney wasn't as naive as the public imagined. She had already been exposed to the pressures, substances, and chaos of fame long before Bobby entered the picture. The world simply preferred to see her as pure, an image too fragile to admit imperfection. When their daughter, Bobby Christina, was born in March 1993, Whitney seemed to find purpose again. She called her daughter her greatest love. In interviews, her eyes lit up when she spoke about her. But even as Whitney embraced motherhood, the cracks in her career and marriage deepened. Rumors of drug use began circulating around Hollywood. Her public appearances grew erratic. Concerts were canceled. She would show up late to interviews, her once bright energy replaced by nervous laughter and distracted stares. Behind closed doors, her world was spinning. The pressures of fame, the expectation to remain flawless, to stay on top, to keep selling millions, were crushing her spirit. Every aspect of her life had become a product. Her voice, her body, her marriage, even her pain, all belonged to the public. She had become an image, not a person. And images, no matter how iconic, eventually crack. By the mid-1990s, Whitney's career was still monumental, but her focus began to waver. She released the soundtrack for The Preacher's Wife in 1996, which included gospel songs that brought her back to her roots. Singing for God, she said, helped her find herself again. The album became the best-selling gospel album of all time, but behind the spiritual revival was a woman privately battling addiction, exhaustion, and marital conflict. Bobby and Whitney's relationship was now tabloid fodder. Fights, police calls, public spats, the kind of drama that sells magazines. But what those headlines missed was the intimacy that still tied them together. They loved each other fiercely, sometimes destructively. "You love so hard it hurts," Whitney once said. "And when it hurts, you fight harder." It was a cycle of passion and pain that neither could escape. Clive Davis, her longtime mentor, grew increasingly worried. He urged her to get help, to rest, to rediscover her center. But Whitney, proud and private, brushed off the concern. "Everyone has their struggles," she'd say. "Mine just get printed." Yet the signs were becoming undeniable. Her once flawless performances became inconsistent. At some shows, her voice still soared like heaven, at others, she seemed lost, out of sync, disconnected. Fans didn't know what to think. The tabloids called it the downfall of a diva. Her relationship with Bobby grew darker. He was arrested several times, including one incident in which Whitney alleged he had physically assaulted her. Friends described a household filled with love and volatility in equal measure, laughter one moment, shouting the next. Their home was both sanctuary and battlefield. As Whitney's image faltered, the media that once worshipped her turned cruel. Late-night hosts mocked her, magazines ran unflattering photos. The same industry that had crowned her the voice now painted her as unstable. For Whitney, who had built her identity around being perfect, that public rejection was devastating. She began to retreat from the spotlight, spending more time isolated at home. In 1998, she released My Love Is Your Love, her first studio album in 8 years. The sound was modern, hip-hop infused, raw, emotional. Songs like Heartbreak Hotel and It's Not Right But It's Okay felt like messages from a woman reclaiming her power. Critics praised it, and for a while, Whitney seemed re-energized. Her voice was raspier but still powerful, carrying the weight of her experiences. The album sold millions, reminding the world that no matter what they said about her, her gift was still undeniable. But that resurgence couldn't erase the shadows closing in. By the early 2000s, her personal life was unraveling faster than ever. The infamous 2002 Diane Sawyer interview shocked fans. Whitney, thin and jittery, defended herself against drug rumors. When asked about crack cocaine, she infamously replied, "Crack is whack." The phrase became a cultural meme, overshadowing her vulnerability in that moment. What viewers didn't see was a woman trying desperately to protect what was left of her dignity. Her relationship with Bobby was still toxic, but she couldn't walk away. But beneath the chaos, there were moments of heartbreaking honesty, Whitney laughing, teasing, loving her husband and daughter. Her health declined. Her voice, that instrument of divine perfection, began to falter. Years of stress, smoking, and addiction had taken their toll. When she performed, her voice cracked where it once soared. Critics called her a shadow of her former self, but those who knew her said she still sang with heart. Even when she was broken, one backup singer later said, "You could still feel God in her voice." By 2006, her marriage to Bobby had become unsustainable. She filed for divorce that year, gaining custody of Bobby Christina. Many hoped that leaving him would mark her rebirth, that Whitney would finally heal. But addiction is a haunting thing, it doesn't vanish with a signature on a divorce paper. Whitney tried to rebuild. She reunited with Clive Davis, who believed she still had one more comeback left in her. In 2009, she released I Look to You, an album that sounded like both confession and prayer. The title track was a cry for strength. After all my strength is gone, in you I can be strong. The album debuted at number 1. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like the phoenix had risen. Fans celebrated her return, industry peers cheered her resilience. But beneath the surface, the pain remained. She embarked on a world tour, but her voice struggled to carry the weight of her legend. The church girl who once sang for love had spent decades singing for survival. Fame, fortune, and expectation had hollowed her joy. The love story that began as rebellion had ended in heartbreak. The pressure that came with perfection had consumed the girl who once sang to heal others. And the shadow of fame, that silent, relentless presence, was now following her everywhere. Still, Whitney tried to smile. She attended industry events, posed for photos, and hinted at new projects. But those close to her saw the exhaustion in her eyes. She was still fighting, for her voice, her peace, her soul. The final chapter of her life would unfold in a single hotel suite in Beverly Hills, a place meant for luxury, but forever stained by loss. After years of chaos, she was slowly making her way back to Hollywood's good graces. There was talk of a comeback, and she was determined to prove she still had the voice, the charisma, and the spirit that once made her unstoppable. Whitney had started her life singing gospel in the church, now she was playing a mother guiding her daughter through the perils of fame. Jordan Sparks later recalled that Whitney was radiant, full of laughter, kindness, and encouragement. Her energy fluctuated, one day vibrant and strong, the next withdrawn and tired. People who knew her well noticed the pattern, but Whitney brushed it off. "I'm fine, baby," she'd say. "I'm always fine." Behind the scenes, the strain was visible. Years of addiction had taken their toll, her voice was raspier, her health fragile. Yet she refused to give up. She rehearsed tirelessly, eager to prove to the world, and to herself, that she still belonged on that stage, in that spotlight. Sparkle wrapped filming in 2011, and Whitney seemed optimistic. She told friends she felt ready for the next chapter. For the first time in years, there was light in her voice. But the entertainment industry is a cruel mirror. As soon as the movie buzz began, the tabloids followed. Paparazzi photos surfaced showing Whitney disheveled, exhausted, and unsteady. Some speculated she had relapsed, others claimed she was sick. Her loved ones urged her to take it easy, to rest. But Whitney was restless. Her comeback meant everything to her. She wanted to silence the critics who said she was finished. In early February 2012, she arrived in Los Angeles for Grammy Week, one of the busiest and most glamorous times in the music industry. The Beverly Hilton Hotel was buzzing with stars, producers, and executives attending Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy party. For Whitney, it was familiar territory. Clive wasn't just her mentor, he was family, the men who had discovered her at 19 and guided her to superstardom. The party was a yearly tradition, a celebration of music and success. Whitney planned to attend, to reunite with friends, and to remind everyone that she was still here. But those who saw her in those final days say she seemed off. On February 9, she appeared at a pre-Grammy event with Brandy, Monica, and Clive Davis. Cameras captured her greeting them warmly, but her behavior drew concern. She was sweating heavily, her eyes glassy, her speech slightly slurred. When she hugged Brandy, she appeared anxious, distracted. Later, she got into an argument with a friend outside the venue, her emotions running high. For the paparazzi lenses flashing all around her, it was another spectacle. For those who truly loved her, it was another warning sign. The next night, February 10, she stopped by a rehearsal for Clive Davis's party at the Beverly Hilton. She sang briefly with Kelly Price during a small gathering, an impromptu moment that would become haunting in retrospect. Her voice cracked, her breathing was labored, but there was still that unmistakable magic, that tone that could fill a room even when she barely tried. She sang, "Jesus Loves Me," and the words carried an eerie weight. Those who were there said it sounded like both a prayer and a goodbye. The following morning, Whitney was seen around the hotel looking disoriented. Some staff later described her as agitated and erratic. She reportedly spent hours on the phone, shuffling between her room and the lobby. Witnesses said she looked tired, unsteady, a woman worn down by years of fighting battles no one could see. But to everyone else, she was still Whitney Houston, glamorous, famous, untouchable. Nobody wanted to believe that she was truly in danger. That evening, on February 11, 2012, the Beverly Hilton was preparing for Clive Davis's iconic pre-Grammy party. Upstairs, in Suite 434, Whitney was taking a bath, getting ready for the night. The suite was filled with her entourage, makeup artists, assistants, family members. Music played softly in the background. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. Instead, it would become one of the darkest in music history. At around 3:30 p.m., Whitney's assistant left the room briefly to run an errand. When she returned about half an hour later, she found Whitney submerged in the bathtub, unresponsive. Panic erupted. Security and paramedics were called immediately, but it was too late. Whitney Houston, the voice that had defined an era, was pronounced dead at 3:55 p.m. The cause, accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. Downstairs, guests were arriving for Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party, completely unaware that tragedy had just unfolded above them. As news began to spread, disbelief rippled through the hotel. Many begged Clive to cancel the event, but he decided to proceed, framing it as a celebration of Whitney's life. Some understood the sentiment. Others found it disturbing. Music executives, celebrities, and artists toasted champagne as police conducted their investigation just floors away. The contrast was surreal, grief and glamour colliding in the same building. When the world found out, time seemed to stop. The headlines were immediate and merciless: Whitney Houston dead at 48. Fans gathered outside the Beverly Hilton, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Across the globe, radio stations played "I Will Always Love You" on repeat. The song, once a declaration of love, had become a eulogy. But behind the media frenzy were the painful questions. How did this happen? How could a woman so loved, so gifted, die so tragically? Those close to her weren't surprised. Many said she had been struggling in silence for too long, that her fame had become both her crown and her curse. She'd spent decades chasing a perfection no one could sustain, and the pressure had finally consumed her. In the days that followed, disturbing details emerged. Prescription bottles were found in her room, Xanax, Valium, and others. The toxicology report later revealed a mix of substances, including cocaine. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, but many believed it was more than that, a slow, spiritual drowning that had begun years before. Her family was shattered. Her daughter, Bobby Christina, was inconsolable. She clung to her mother's old clothes, her perfume, her songs. "She's not gone," she told friends. "She's just sleeping." But grief is a cruel teacher, and Bobby's pain would later mirror her mother's too closely for comfort. At the Grammys the following night, Jennifer Hudson performed "I Will Always Love You" in tribute. The audience sat in stunned silence, tears streaming, hearts broken. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was the final goodbye to a voice that had defined a generation. In the aftermath, Sparkle was released posthumously. Watching it felt like witnessing Whitney's final message. Her performance was tender, maternal, and deeply emotional. She sang "His Eye Is on the Sparrow," her last recorded song, with the same church-born conviction that had first made her a star. It was a haunting full circle. The girl from Newark who began singing gospel ended her journey singing to God once more. Friends said that in her final weeks, Whitney had been reflective. She spoke often about wanting to sing gospel again, to return to the purity of her roots. She was tired of the industry, the expectations, the gossip. She just wanted peace. "I've seen the highest highs," she reportedly told one friend. "Now I just want calm." But peace had always been elusive for Whitney. Fame gave her everything, except the one thing she needed most: space to simply exist. From the moment she stepped into the spotlight, she belonged to everyone else. Every note she sang became a product, every mistake a scandal. When the world finally stopped applauding, she was left standing alone in the silence. Whitney's death became one of those moments that froze Hollywood in time. For weeks, television networks replayed her greatest performances: the Star-Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl, her electrifying medley at the 1994 AMAs, her bodyguard ballads. It was as if the world was collectively remembering what it had lost, not just a singer, but a soul that had carried so many. In the years since, her legacy has only grown more complicated. People debate the choices she made, the people she trusted, the pressures she faced. But the truth remains painfully simple: Whitney Houston was human. Brilliant, broken, beautiful, human. And that humanity, not just her perfection, is what makes her story endure. When the autopsy report was released, it detailed a mix of substances in her system and evidence of long-term heart disease. But beyond the science, beyond the tragedy, was something that can't be measured: a lifetime of giving too much of herself to the world. Her final months were a quiet storm, a woman torn between redemption and relapse, hope and heartbreak. She wanted to heal, but the ghosts of fame never stopped calling her name. In the end, the music industry mourned, her fans wept, and those who knew her best were left with an impossible question: could anyone have saved Whitney Houston? Perhaps not. Because the thing that made her shine, that need to be perfect, to please, to give everything, was also what destroyed her. But even in death, Whitney Houston didn't fade. Her voice still fills arenas, her songs still comfort the brokenhearted, her name still echoes through generations. She remains both a warning and a wonder, proof that talent can touch the divine, even when the soul beneath it is fragile. The world stood still on February 11, 2012. Whitney Houston, the golden voice that defined generations, was gone. The news spread like a shockwave through television networks, social media feeds, and radio stations across the globe. It was the eve of the Grammy Awards, one of the most glamorous nights in Hollywood, yet everything suddenly felt muted, surreal. Reporters swarmed the Beverly Hilton hotel, where her lifeless body had been discovered in a bathtub. Paparazzi lenses flashed outside the building as stunned fans gathered behind police tape, holding candles, sobbing, and singing her songs in disbelief. For many, Whitney wasn't just a celebrity, she was a cultural phenomenon. The world mourned her not as an untouchable superstar, but as someone they'd grown up with. Her music had scored weddings, graduations, heartbreaks, and triumphs. The thought that her story had ended alone in a hotel bathroom felt almost unbearable. But the tragedy didn't end there. It was only the beginning of a long, heartbreaking aftermath that would expose Hollywood's cold machinery, media obsession, and the generational pain of a family caught between fame and grief. When paramedics arrived at the Beverly Hilton, the scene was chaotic. Whitney had been found submerged in the bathtub with her face underwater. The water was scalding hot, so hot that it reportedly left burns on her back. Prescription bottles lined the counter, Xanax, Valium, and other medications meant to calm her anxiety. The autopsy later revealed traces of cocaine, cannabis, and several prescription drugs in her system. The official cause of death: accidental drowning due to the effects of heart disease and cocaine use. But accidental felt too simple for fans and insiders who knew how fragile Whitney's final years had been. Questions began circulating: who supplied the drugs? How long had she been alone before being found? Why were her entourage members so vague about the timeline of that night? And why had no one checked on her sooner, knowing her erratic state in the days leading up to Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party? Inside the hotel, chaos collided with calculation. Even as her body was still being examined, event staff began preparing for the glitzy annual Clive Davis Gala downstairs, the same event Whitney had been set to attend. The thought horrified fans. Upstairs, police tape sealed off her suite. Downstairs, celebrities sipped champagne under chandeliers, paying tributes from the same building where the star lay lifeless. The duality of that night, glamour and death under one roof, symbolized everything tragic about Hollywood itself. A week later, Whitney's body was flown back to her hometown of Newark, New Jersey, where the funeral took place at the New Hope Baptist Church, the same place she first sang gospel as a child. The church that once echoed with her teenage voice now became the site of her farewell. Her casket, draped in white and gold, sat at the altar surrounded by white flowers. Her mother, Whitney Houston, sat in the front pew, expressionless but broken. Bobby Brown arrived briefly but left soon after, reportedly due to tensions with Whitney's family and their security arrangements. It was a funeral fit for royalty, attended by Hollywood's elite: Oprah Winfrey, Tyler Perry, Clive Davis, Stevie Wonder, Kevin Costner, and Alicia Keys. Costner's eulogy struck a deep chord. He reminisced about Whitney's insecurities before the bodyguard and the purity of her soul that fame couldn't erase. "You weren't just good enough," he said, voice breaking. "You were great." Alicia Keys performed "Send Me an Angel." Stevie Wonder sang a reworked version of "Ribbon in the Sky." And as the service ended, Whitney's haunting recording of "I Will Always Love You" filled the church. The entire congregation wept, some collapsing under the emotional weight. Her golden casket was carried out as the music swelled, and the world said goodbye to a voice that would never be replaced. In death, Whitney became the centerpiece of a media storm. Tabloids dissected every aspect of her final hours: the drugs, the bathtub, the bruises, the so-called mystery guests. Former associates, assistants, and friends came forward to sell interviews and reveal private details. Even worse, some online outlets published leaked photos of her hotel bathroom, showing the scene where she died, a grotesque invasion of dignity. TV networks aired documentaries within weeks, speculating about her downfall. The public wanted answers, but the entertainment industry turned the tragedy into a business. Every replayed clip of her off-key performance, every shocking detail, segment, raked in ratings. It was as though the same world that had celebrated her now fed on her demise. Behind the scenes, her family struggled to hold on to what little peace remained. Whitney Houston released a statement pleading with the media to "let our family grieve with dignity." But there was no stopping the storm. Even Whitney's daughter, Bobbi Kristina Brown, became a target of constant paparazzi attention, hounded wherever she went, her grief put on public display. Whitney's only child, Bobbi Kristina, was just 18 when her mother died. They'd been inseparable, and the bond was both beautiful and painful. Whitney had once called her the love of my life. But after the funeral, Bobby seemed lost. She was spotted at her mother's grave frequently, wearing the same clothes Whitney had worn, even speaking of hearing her mother's voice in dreams. In one interview, she confessed, "I can still hear her call my name. I can still feel her near." The parallels between Whitney's life and her daughter's soon became hauntingly similar. Bobby Christina started spending time with Nick Gordon, a young man Whitney had taken in years earlier and raised like a son. Their relationship blurred familial lines and drew public criticism. When they referred to each other as husband and wife, tabloids exploded. Yet behind the scandal, Bobby was sinking, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Friends described her as withdrawn, depressed, and increasingly dependent on drugs. Her social media posts were cryptic, filled with grief and longing. Then, eerily echoing her mother's death, tragedy struck again. On January 31, 2015, almost 3 years after Whitney's passing, Bobby Christina was found unresponsive in a bathtub at her home in Georgia. The scene was hauntingly similar: water, prescription drugs nearby, and a young woman whose life was slowly slipping away. She was placed in a medically induced coma and remained in that state for nearly 6 months before passing away on July 26, 2015. She was only 22. The official cause: lobar pneumonia due to brain damage caused by immersion in water and drug intoxication. The shadow of Whitney's death had returned, the same tragic script playing out again, this time with her daughter as the victim. In the aftermath, speculation swirled about Nick Gordon's role in Bobby Christina's death. The Houston family accused him of foul play, claiming he was abusive and manipulative. A civil lawsuit later found him legally responsible for her death, though he was never criminally charged. Gordon himself would die 5 years later from a heroin overdose, adding yet another dark chapter to this cursed narrative. The public couldn't help but see the eerie pattern: 2 women, mother and daughter, both found lifeless in bathtubs, both surrounded by drugs, both victims of fame's suffocating glare. Fans began calling it the Houston curse, while others saw it as the tragic result of generational trauma and Hollywood's predatory culture. Cissy Houston, who outlived both her daughter and granddaughter, retreated from the spotlight. Her interviews grew rare, her voice heavy with pain. "I've lost my baby and my baby's baby," she said once. That's not something you ever heal from. Even in death, Whitney's presence remains powerful. Her voice still fills arenas, commercials, and soundtracks, haunting, immortal, untouchable. But for many fans, it also carries a deep sadness, a reminder of the woman behind the perfection. The world saw a legend, but few saw the fragile human being who longed to be loved, who struggled to find peace amid the noise. In the years following her death, several posthumous projects emerged: documentaries, tribute albums, even a hologram tour. But none could capture the real Whitney, the woman who laughed loudly, who sang from her soul, who believed in God despite her demons. Today, when fans visit her grave in Fairview Cemetery, they often find notes that read, "You're free now." It's a sentiment that carries both grief and grace, the hope that somewhere beyond the fame and heartbreak, Whitney finally found the peace that eluded her in life. And as her voice continues to echo through time, from church choirs to global stages, one thing remains undeniable: Whitney Houston's story may have ended in tragedy, but her legacy will forever be entwined with the purest sound the world ever heard. Her rise was legendary. Her fall was heartbreaking. But her voice will never die. Whitney Houston's story didn't end in that Beverly Hilton bathtub. It didn't fade with the closing of her casket or the final note of "I will always love you" echoing through the church. Her story, in many ways, was just beginning, a posthumous reckoning that forced Hollywood, the music industry, and even her fans to confront the brutal machinery that consumes its brightest stars. Whitney's death was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. Her life, her rise, her fall, and her final days, became a mirror reflecting the dark side of fame, the cruelty of addiction, and the price of perfection in a world that demands it relentlessly. Even now, more than a decade later, the shadow of Whitney's life looms large over pop culture. Her name is spoken in the same breath as other legends gone too soon: Michael Jackson, Prince, Amy Winehouse. But Whitney's case feels uniquely haunting because it revealed something uncomfortable, that even a voice touched by the divine could be broken by human pain. The Greatest Love of All wasn't just a song, it was a plea that the industry and her fans never fully heard until it was too late. After Whitney's death, Hollywood and the global music industry were forced to take a hard look at how they treat artists, especially black women, who become symbols rather than human beings. For decades, Whitney had been marketed as flawless, pure, untouchable. Her image was tightly controlled, the perfect blend of gospel roots and commercial appeal. She wasn't allowed to make mistakes. She wasn't allowed to show pain. When her image began to fracture, the cracked voice on stage, the slurred interviews, the tabloid photos, the same industry that once crowned her as America's sweetheart, turned on her mercilessly. Late-night hosts mocked her. Magazines ridiculed her marriage. Radio stations refused to play her new songs, labeling her a fallen diva. And through it all, Whitney was still expected to sing, to perform, to smile for the cameras. Her downfall revealed how fame strips people of humanity. In the aftermath of her death, several artists, from Mariah Carey to Beyoncé to Alicia Keys, publicly acknowledged how the industry's pressure can destroy even the strongest spirits. Whitney's story became a warning: behind every glossy performance, there's a person fighting to stay afloat. In the years following her passing, many record labels and management teams began to change how they approached artist wellness. Conversations around mental health, therapy, and substance abuse became more open. Artists like Demi Lovato, Adele, and Lady Gaga cited Whitney as an example of what happens when fame becomes suffocating. Even Clive Davis, her mentor, admitted that her struggles were a wake-up call to protect artists beyond their profitability. Before Whitney, drug addiction in the entertainment world was often treated like a moral failure, not a disease. She became the unwilling poster child for substance abuse, a subject of mockery rather than empathy. But her death forced a shift in public perception. Suddenly, her story wasn't just about fame gone wrong, it was about the human cost of untreated trauma. Interviews with Whitney's friends and family in the years after her death revealed a pattern of exhaustion, loneliness, and dependency masked by a superstar's smile. She had tried rehab multiple times, often emerging with hope, only to be pulled back into old habits by those around her. Her fame made it nearly impossible to escape the cycle. There was always someone ready to supply, someone ready to exploit her weakness. After 2012, major award shows began incorporating tributes not only as performances but as reminders of the importance of artist care. Charities focusing on addiction recovery, especially among musicians, began citing Whitney's story as a rallying point. Programs like MusiCares expanded their reach, and the phrase, Whitney Effect, quietly entered industry circles, meaning the renewed effort to provide support systems for artists before it's too late. The stigma began to shift. Where once the public saw crack is whack, they now saw a woman fighting demons alone in the spotlight. Whitney's story made it impossible to ignore the humanity behind the headlines. Before Whitney, the term diva was synonymous with glamour and perfection. After Whitney, it came to mean something deeper: resilience, vulnerability, and survival in the face of relentless pressure. Modern artists from Ariana Grande to Jennifer Hudson have cited Whitney as their guiding light. They don't just admire her voice, they study her emotional power, her stage presence, and her courage to be vulnerable even when the world judged her for it. In interviews, Beyoncé often refers to Whitney as the blueprint. Not just vocally, but emotionally, the balance of grace and grit. Even artists outside R&B, like Adele and Lady Gaga, have described Whitney as the standard by which they measure their own connection to the audience. Her songs became more than hits, they became emotional testaments. I Will Always Love You is no longer just a ballad of love, it's an anthem of farewell to a woman who gave the world her everything. The Greatest Love of All feels prophetic now, as if Whitney was warning the next generation about self-worth before fame consumes it. And in a poetic twist, Whitney's legacy helped dismantle the same perfection myth that once destroyed her. Today's pop stars are freer to be messy, open, and imperfect, to admit when they're struggling. They cry on stage. They speak about anxiety and therapy. That vulnerability, in many ways, began with Whitney's fall. Her story gave permission to the next generation to be real. When Bobby Christina followed her mother's tragic path, the industry's shock turned into guilt. Her death wasn't just seen as a coincidence, it was viewed as a haunting mirror of everything the world failed to change after Whitney's passing. 2 generations of the same family lost to addiction, isolation, and fame's suffocating glare. The eerie similarities, both found in bathtubs, both surrounded by prescription drugs, made the Houston family's tragedy a cautionary tale. It exposed how grief, when left untreated, can become generational. Hollywood's endless appetite for spectacle left no room for healing. After Bobby Christina's death, mental health advocacy became central to music industry reform. Artists began demanding therapy clauses in their contracts, and managers were encouraged to undergo wellness training. What was once whispered in back rooms was now openly discussed on red carpets and award stages. Whitney's story, and her daughters, forced a cultural reckoning. Fame without protection is fatal. And protection means more than security guards and lawyers, it means community, honesty, and compassion. As technology advanced, Whitney's posthumous career became both a tribute and a controversy. In 2020, a hologram tour featuring Whitney's digital likeness launched across Europe. Fans were divided, some called it a beautiful resurrection, others saw it as exploitation. The hologram swayed and sang, her movements recreated by motion capture, her vocals stitched together from live recordings. To many, it was eerie, a ghost brought back to perform for profit. Then came documentaries like Whitney, 2018, and Can I Be Me, 2017, which peeled back the facade to reveal the woman behind the myth. They exposed family tensions, the pressures of fame, and the unresolved pain that haunted her relationships. But they also reignited love for her, reminding audiences of her laugh, her warmth, her humor. Whitney's story, retold again and again, became both a lesson and a legacy, a reminder of the fine line between honoring the dead and commodifying their memory. Hollywood, as always, struggled to walk that line. Yet beyond the documentaries, the holograms, and the endless remixes, something genuine persisted, the voice. Pure, untouched, eternal. When fans close their eyes and hear Run to You or One Moment in Time, they don't think about her scandals, they think about her power, her soul. That's how Whitney truly lives on. Whitney's influence went far beyond the stage. She broke racial barriers, becoming one of the first black women to achieve universal pop superstardom in the 1980s. Before her, record executives doubted whether a gospel-trained black singer could dominate mainstream pop charts. Whitney shattered that doubt with every note. Her success opened doors for future icons, Beyoncé, Rihanna, Alicia Keys, who walked the path she carved through pure, undeniable talent. Her crossover appeal also changed television and film. The Bodyguard was a cultural phenomenon, grossing over $400 million worldwide. It made her one of the first black women to lead a global box office hit while simultaneously topping music charts. Hollywood could no longer claim that black women couldn't sell. Whitney had proved otherwise. In the years following her death, numerous awards and honors continued to cement her place in history: posthumous inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, lifetime achievement tributes, and remastered albums that introduced her music to a new generation. Schools, choirs, and talent shows still perform her songs as rites of passage. She didn't just influence a sound, she redefined what a global superstar could be. Whitney Houston's life was a paradox, a divine voice trapped in human pain. Her rise taught the world about possibility, and her fall taught it about compassion. She showed that even legends can break, and that the pursuit of perfection is often the most dangerous illusion. Her death became a cautionary tale for fame itself. It forced a collective question: what do we demand of the people we idolize? Must they be flawless? Or can we love them for being human? Hollywood, in its own way, has softened since then. Social media has made stars more vulnerable and visible, but also more empowered to tell their stories directly. The once taboo subjects of mental health, addiction, and burnout are now openly discussed. And every time those conversations arise, Whitney's name lingers in the background, a silent reminder of what happens when we look away too long. More than anything, Whitney's legacy is her sound. It remains unmatched, untouched, and unduplicated. That effortless modulation, that controlled power, that spiritual resonance, no artist has ever fully replicated it. Even her live performances, decades later, still send chills through new generations of listeners who weren't even alive when she first sang. Her music continues to chart, her videos continue to trend, and her songs still bring people to tears. That's immortality, not holograms or documentaries, but emotion that transcends time. When the world listens to Whitney Houston, it doesn't just hear music, it hears struggle, triumph, pain, faith, and love all at once. That is her true legacy, a sound so powerful it defied even death. In the end, Whitney Houston's story is both a tragedy and a triumph. It's a warning to the industry, a prayer for artists, and a reminder to fans that greatness often hides unimaginable pain. But it's also a story of grace, because even through all the chaos, Whitney's voice remains pure, radiant, untouchable. Her life changed Hollywood, but her voice changed the world. And somewhere beyond the noise of fame and sorrow, that voice still rises, soaring through eternity, singing not for the cameras, not for the charts, but for freedom. Because for Whitney Houston, that was always the greatest love of all. Whitney Houston's life was a paradox, a divine voice trapped in human pain. Her rise taught the world about possibility, and her fall taught it about compassion. She showed that even legends can break, and that the pursuit of perfection is often the most dangerous illusion. Her death became a cautionary tale for fame itself. It forced a collective question: what do we demand of the people we idolize? Must they be flawless? Or can we love them for being human? Hollywood, in its own way, has softened since then. Social media has made stars more vulnerable and visible, but also more empowered to tell their stories directly. The once taboo subjects of mental health, addiction, and burnout are now openly discussed. And every time those conversations arise, Whitney's name lingers in the background, a silent reminder of what happens when we look away too long. More than anything, Whitney's legacy is her sound. It remains unmatched, untouched, and unduplicated. That effortless modulation, that controlled power, that spiritual resonance, no artist has ever fully replicated it. Even her live performances, decades later, still send chills through new generations of listeners who weren't even alive when she first sang. Her music continues to chart, her videos continue to trend, and her songs still bring people to tears. That's immortality, not holograms or documentaries, but emotion that transcends time. When the world listens to Whitney Houston, it doesn't just hear music, it hears struggle, triumph, pain, faith, and love all at once. That is her true legacy, a sound so powerful it defied even death. In the end, Whitney Houston's story is both a tragedy and a triumph. It's a warning to the industry, a prayer for artists, and a reminder to fans that greatness often hides unimaginable pain. But it's also a story of grace, because even through all the chaos, Whitney's voice remains pure, radiant, untouchable. Her life changed Hollywood, but her voice changed the world. And somewhere beyond the noise of fame and sorrow, that voice still rises, soaring through eternity, singing not for the cameras, not for the charts, but for freedom. Because for Whitney Houston, that was always the greatest love of all. Because for Whitney Houston, that was always the greatest love of all.